Tarviiko tätä laittaa päälle? Ei, mutta se on ok. Okei, ei tarvitse. Mun pitää odottaa, että he laskee kättä. Että nauhoitus pyörii. Tai siis toi. Dear invited guests and speakers, dear colleagues and friends of the Migration Institute. A warm welcome. My name is Saara Pellander. I'm the director of the Migration Institute of Finland, and it is with humbleness and with great joy that I have the honor of opening these 2 days of migration into the future. When we brainstormed ideas about our 50th anniversary, we soon all agreed that instead of only looking back at an impressive 50 years of migration research and documentation, we also want to look into the future. Predicting the future is difficult, as we all know, and many developments over the recent years, such as tragic wars, conflicts, or the pandemic, have shown us that things might change rather drastically without us having been prepared. Even if we cannot predict the future, one thing that we know, when we look not only at the history of humankind overall, but also at more modern migration histories, is that people always have been on the move, in one way or other, and they always will be. Thus, we wanted to take the opportunity to discuss the future of migration through 4 different themes with researchers and other experts, decision makers, actors from civil society, with you. One of these themes is actually related to the future of preserving and documenting migration histories, namely our topic of community-based archives. We will furthermore discuss climate change and migration and the labor market, as well as regional development. These issues are not only topical right now, but they need fresh ideas and approaches, innovative research, and collaboration between different societal actors, which is the main aim of this symposium. The Institute has, from its very founding days, closely collaborated with municipalities, ministries, and NGOs, as well as with many universities. Therefore, in addition to highlighting the research of the Migration Institute, we wanted our 50th anniversary year to also acknowledge these significant, diverse, and long-standing collaborations. We are not only extremely grateful for all the past collaboration and the institutional, financial, and thematic support that we have received from many of you over the past 50 years. But we are also very eager to work with you in the future and think about new ways forward, about new questions to be asked, new research topics, or networks to be developed. We hope that the next 2 days will make this dialogue possible. If the historians among you, and I know there are quite many of us, are starting to feel uneasy about all this talk about the future, don't you worry. We also like the past, and we are also looking back. You might be aware of our anniversary exhibition, which you passed when you entered this room there in the hallway. The exhibition is based on our popular Tervetuloa Terve Menoa podcast series that I can strongly recommend, as well as the connected anniversary publication. Here we try to open up new perspectives to historical topics and find commonalities and differences between migratory movements of the past and of today. Another way in which we honor not only migration histories, but our own history, is through a special edition of our Migration Muuttoliike journal. The journal has been published since the Institute was established, so since 1974, which is as such already quite impressive. Now, we had Marika Saarinen and then later Markku Mattila gone through all the issues that were ever published and identified topics that were of particular interest during different periods. What we did was actually republish some of these original articles and then invited researchers who work on these same topics today to provide a more current perspective at how we look at this issue today. The topics are related to Finns in Argentina and Paraguay from 1974. This is a text from the founding year. About multiculturalism in Canada, 1983. Exclusion and discrimination of migrants and refugees from 1996. Regional development and migration from 2000. And the Finnish-Russia border relations from 2013. The last article about the Finnish-Russian border is in English, the other one's in Finnish. As you can tell, many of the topics that we discuss in migration studies and in the society overall today have been on the research and political agenda already many decades ago. You will find the journal on the table outside of this door, where you also find flyers and information about the Institute, and we will gladly hand out a copy to each of you to take home and read these amazing, interesting articles. A big thank you again to Marika and Markku for the enormous editing and historical digging work that they did. Before I give the floor to our keynote speakers, I would like to say some thank yous. The biggest thank you, of course, goes to the founding members of the Institute, one of whom, Olavi Koivukangas, we have the honor of welcoming in the audience today. Maybe a short applause for Olavi. I know Olavi hates when he is not allowed to speak, but he's not. But tonight at our reception, he will talk more about the history of the Migration Institute and how he was involved in founding and also directing it for many years. Kiitos Olavi ihan kaikesta ja erityisesti siitä, että olet tänään mukana juhlimassa tätä tärkeää päivää kanssamme. Next, I want to thank all those different institutions that were part of founding the Institute and with whom we have collaborated closely for all these years. In particular, all of you who are part of our board and of our council. And of course, a very warm thank you goes to the cities of Turku, Seinäjoki, and to Åbo Academy for providing us with our premises and office spaces. To them and to all of you from near and far, who have arrived today from different towns, different countries, from different organizations, thank you for coming and for discussing these important topics with us. We are looking forward to a very fruitful exchange between researchers and many other important societal actors. To all of you who either have worked at the Institute or are working there now, this place and this community would not be the same without you. I'm truly and greatly glad that so many of you are here today. In particular, those of you who have been in the organizing committee of this symposium and who are organizing or leading the working groups today and tomorrow. Marja Tiilikainen, Pihla Siim, Samira Saramo, Tuiri Liimatainen, Pekka Kettunen, Sari Vanhanen, Mika Raunio, Linda Backman, Camilla Marukka Almimar, Evelina Lyytinen, Tuomas Hanel, whom we also have the pleasure to hear as a keynote speaker tomorrow. I know this has taken a lot of additional time from your otherwise already very busy schedules, and I'm extremely grateful and thank you for all your wonderful input, ideas, and dedication to this event. Thank you also to Paola Arizaga Salazar and Ella Nybeck for your assistance and help during this symposium, and in preparing for it, we really appreciate it so much. Katri Kanervo, our information specialist, and Kirsi Sainio, our administrative director, you have had a very busy year, and in particular this symposium with its invitations and reservations and registration forms and so forth. This would not have been possible without you. Suuret ja lämpimät kiitokset teille. And a very, very big and warm thank you to our anniversary year coordinator, Merja Skaffari-Multala, with whom I guess all of you have emailed or been in contact somewhere or other. Thank you, Merja, for your warm and happy spirit and for bringing together all these pieces of that very complicated puzzle which our busy anniversary year has been. Last but not least, we are very glad to have 4 amazing keynote speakers at this event, a collective welcome, and thank you to all of you for bringing your knowledge and expertise to this event. Before I'll finally introduce our first speaker, I want to go through some house rules. The Migration Institute of Finland is committed to promoting equity, equality, and anti-racism. Please bear this in mind when asking questions or giving comments. Harassment, misogyny, what a difficult word, sexism, racism, ableism, homo and transphobia, body shaming or ageism or any other forms of discrimination are not acceptable, and we will do our best to point out and react to harmful behavior. Please also respect everyone's physical and emotional boundaries, privacy, and pronouns. Do not make assumptions of anyone's gender, sexual orientation, nationality, religion, or their socioeconomic background, or any other personal matters. It is really important that we all remember and critically reflect upon our own privileges and take this into account when we participate in discussions. This actually means listening to others and respecting everyone's viewpoints and experiences. I also encourage everyone to be aware of space that we use when we talk in social situations, especially in terms of giving space to other voices than your own. So recognize the boundary of your knowledge, especially in those areas that are not your expertise or which you don't have experience of, particularly in case of sensitive topics. I know that we are all constantly learning to become better and more empathetic human beings, and we all sometimes make mistakes. So if you are given critical feedback for problematic behavior or for harmful comments, we kindly ask you to take a moment to reflect upon that feedback and what you could learn from it. If any of you, which I hope you won't, but if you do encounter problematic behavior or you feel unsafe, please contact any of the organizers of this event. You can contact those who are wearing a blue Migration Institute t-shirt, myself, and our conference secretary, Merja, if you could wave from the door, and any other of the workshop organizers. And of course, these are all people you can also ask in any practical matters. Merja, after the 2 keynotes, Merja will tell you more about where the different working groups are and where the coffee is served and all this, so don't worry, you'll hear more about that later. A last comment about communication. One is that we will take some photographs during this event. Ella is there in the back. And we might publish these photos in our newsletter or the social media of the Institute. If you do not want to be in a picture, please let Ella there in the back know. And if you publish something yourself during this event, you can use the hashtag, which was there in the back, here, Muuttoliikesymposium. That would be great and appreciated. Now we get to the first keynote. And I'm really, really happy that we have Dr. Niko Humalisto here. He's a leading advocacy specialist at Suomen lähetysseura, the Finnish Evangelical Lutheran Mission. He works there and as this leading advocacy specialist, and he participates in international climate negotiations through the International ACT Alliance. Niko holds a docentship in social geography with a specialization in politics of nature. And he's talking to us today with his lecture, Negotiating Mobilities and Climate Crisis, Perspectives from the Global South. Please give a warm applause to Niko.
Yes. So, Thank you for the invitation and being courageous enough to give me the floor. Because, like mentioned, my specialty is not in the mobility studies, but I think I have adequate enough experiences as a practitioner, but also as a scientist investigating green transition, how we manage climate change and whatnot, to be able to state that we have had perhaps too little attention on the climate mobilities when it comes to actually somehow tackling the issue, but also having the kind of a political understanding of what to do. And I argue that this attention has been inadequate for multiple reasons, but let me start from the most foundational. Ecologists have for several years made the argument that all Earth ecosystems are changing and their species are moving, becoming mobile due to the planetary warming. So everyone is becoming mobile. And this is the reality. Despite the political progress and new commitments on the climate change, this is how it is going. For instance, in the IPCC's last report, out of the 4,000 species analyzed, half was found shifting their habitats to somewhere else, to higher latitudes or towards the north or the south. So in a way, all are seeking continuation of existing in fastly evolving landscapes, and humans, for certain, are not apart from this planetary change. And this is a quote that follows from Rockström, who is the one who introduced the planetary boundaries, and I find this quote quite useful in this context. So, quote, planetary scale and for environmental forcing by human continues, and individual Earth system components are, to an increasing extent, in disequilibrium in relation to the changing conditions. As a consequence, the post-Holocene Earth is still evolving, and ultimate global environmental conditions remain uncertain. And I think this uncertainty is the point of departure when we are talking about mobilities. In a decade or so, an interesting but also very terrifying threshold was exceeded. The human species entered first time in its evolutionary era into the conditions that have never existed before. There is more greenhouse gas emissions in the sky, greenhouse gases in the sky than there has been ever in the history of our species. So in a way, we are at very new terrains for all of us. And what I argue is that this uncertainty of the spaces unfolding due to the climate change should be part of the new kind of spatial understanding and planning as well. So, for instance, according to the best scientific estimations of the tipping points of the polar glaciers melting, they are somewhere in between 1 and 3 Celsius. So I was kind of shocked to realize this point that, in a way, the tipping point might have been already reached, or it is something that we can still avoid. But this potential rise of tens of meters of sea level is something that we cannot just simply overlook when we are planning for futures, not only in terms of mobility, but how we manage ourselves and ensure the respect for the human rights or sustainable development. And for those knowing me, this doesn't come as a surprise that I draw inspiration from this philosopher Bruno Latour, who gives us this kind of a theoretical understanding of where we might understand these mobilities to come. And he discusses in his 2018 book about returning to Earth in a way that might allow us to make more sense about, but also create political strategies to this necessarily happening change of environment and spaces. And in his well-known critiques of modernity, the core matter is the purification of nature and society into distinctive domains in which the former functions more as a stable reserve for the model societies to reach their visions of development. But that was, and increasingly is, a fantasy where the agency of the other than humans were overlooked. So the kind of irony to modernity, even though it has been accused of being too materialistic, that it wasn't never materialist enough to take the seriousness of the problematic relation that it has with the material cycles and biological processes of the world. So when the direct consequences of planetary warming causes loss of lives, livelihoods, and cultural heritage upheld in our daily practices with the non-human world, it's evident that we have simply run out of space and materials to enact our visions of the modern development. Some places might stay as they are, but many don't. What was considered a stable reserve hits us back with forest fires, droughts, and intolerable heat. The very ground that the societies have built their future visions on have begun to shake. And this is the core to returning to Earth as inhabitants, capable of accepting and acting upon the realities of the fastly changing landscapes and the planetary boundaries. In Luther's terms, space has transformed into restless history to which we participate, among others, unquote. Then I move to the topic of the unequal distribution of the climate mobilities. So, while the strategy of discussing climate change as a global problem that affects us all, no one is safe, and all that, it has had the positive sides as a political strategy and messaging, but I think some of the downsides are becoming evident as well. Namely, it is that for many it still remains challenging to understand that why something that is happening globally, it's actually affecting quite differently different spaces and different peoples in the world. So, in a way, we have to make also sense as a political strategy to understand where the pressure to become mobile is high. And this is a capture from the original UNF on the Convention on the Climate Change from the 92. So it kind of gives the outlook of the specific regions that are considered vulnerable to climate change. And of course, those are related then to the pressures to become mobile as well. And of course, this picture has been sharpened, that what kind of a risks climate change poses. But the basic idea of the differentiating exposures to climate change has been there for more than 30 years, written in the climate law. And here I would also pinpoint, I'm sorry, it's too small probably, but it also creates the boundary between the North and South, because it specifically mentions that it is the responsibility of the developed countries to mobilize finances, technological support, and other means of implementation for the developing countries. So this bordering also has existed for a long time. And in line with this bordering, it can be stated that in general the global South has it worse when it comes to the climate change. But that doesn't boil down so much to these kind of natural environmental issues than the questions of poverty and inequality. So the vulnerability is a multifaceted phenomena that cannot be reduced into simple criteria. And it's not like that there are always certain regions or certain countries that would be differentiated, but we also have to bear in mind that it's something that happens internally between people, between social groups. And this is typically acknowledged in these legal documents as this kind of a change of vulnerable populations, persons with disabilities, women, indigenous people, and so forth. So typically, it's not like one reason why people are becoming vulnerable to climate change, but for many reasons. But in order to turn these discussions a little bit more concrete, I will give an example of our working environment in Zimbabwe. And probably you wouldn't guess, but this is the great river Sane, through which the great Zimbabwean empire transported its gold to the harbors of Mozambique. And this is how it has been looking for almost 3 years or so. And you can understand the peril that the local farmers have there. It doesn't look great. Not the actual conditions, because they have been losing not only their crops, but also the potentiality for the future crops. And of course, this has been the El Niño years in the region, which also causes drought, but climate change intensifies those as well. But when it comes to these kind of differentiating exposures, who actually needs to move and where? That becomes a more tricky question. Because in this case of Sane, the heaviest brunt is felt by the small-scale subsistence farmers, because, like I said, that they have lost their livelihoods. And for them, it might be, or they are this kind of on the brink of this, making the decision whether to move or whether to continue in having hope that things would change somehow, somewhere, through some kind of action. But here comes also the tragedy and the kind of economic and social conditions in the limits of adapting, for instance, that commercial industrial agriculture could do there. Because the water is, like my friend who was visiting there, she just said that you just dig a bit and the water is down there. That it's not anywhere, but it's not like a surface water that can be used. And of course, if you have the right technologies, it would become possible to use it for farming. But as it is with the poor populations, they have much lesser capabilities to actually adapt, and thus bigger risks also to become mobile. And this is why I think this is a good example given by my South African colleague, who has mostly been working on the issues of gender-based violence, that she gave a comparison that when it comes to these kind of communities living at the edge of the survival, that becoming mobile, it's a bit like staying in a partnership where there is violence. That mostly for women who live in these kind of situations, going out, moving out from the home of violence, it's never a really good option either if you end up in the streets, because then you don't have any kind of coverage or social support mechanisms or finances or whatnot. And this is the similar situation that we face in several corners of the world, that when there isn't like any clear strategies of when to move, where to kind of relocate your livelihoods and cultures, it's a little bit like going on the streets without having any idea how the things will turn out for you. So I think this issue of mobility, it's conditional. It's not like absolute that climate change determines some certain outcomes. It affects, but we also have the opportunities to do something different. And here comes my second example. This was a field visit in Nepal, where we support the communities of the casteless groups, Dalits. And the situation was kind of bleak for them, for this one particular group, because they had been pushed out of their forest homes. Basically, they were living within this kind of old-growth forest, but when it was established as a nature reserve, they were kicked out. And the nearest location they were able to find was this kind of a little bit similar riverbed. But there was a river flowing, and they have established this kind of their livelihoods, agriculture, animal husbandry, even schools and whatnots basically on the riverbed. And what we have been doing is to support also these kind of adaptive capacities of the community, that we try to also create conditions that when the river floods, that the outcomes will not be drastic, that lives are lost. But by the end of the day, we also know that there is a certain cycle of flooding, which will, at some point, most definitely create these kind of floods that will result in loss of livelihoods and probably even lives. And this is the dilemma that we face. Because, of course, for those people, it would become much more kind of less risky for the future to move somewhere where they could practice their culture. But the conditions within that country, it's not good for the landless Dalits, who are the kind of the lowest caste. So there isn't anybody who is going to, take them hands and say that, oh, here is plenty of space for you, come here. No. It is like either we do this and try at the same time create these kind of conditions that the human rights would be respected, but at the same time we have to try to create also these kind of conditions how to survive. So this is a kind of illustration about the agency that we can create. This is actually not looking like it was much less infrastructure there, but this is the artist vision of the situation. But this is the kind of a situation where we are. But what would happen if the once in 3 decades or so flooding comes? It would leave complete disruption in the kind of average livelihoods of those people living there, and the dislocation of the populations would also be completely uncontrollable. So what we try to do is that we create, through different kind of early warning systems and disaster risk reduction planning, but also by building these kind of localized capacities to mobilize support when the flooding comes. These kind of conditions that the impacts of the climate event wouldn't be as drastic as they are. And for instance, concerning the vulnerable groups, that there would be specific design, for instance, for the persons with disabilities to actually find shelter and not become these kind of victims to the events. And then, of course, the situation is also that we need to think about the possibilities of returning and recovering from these shocks, because that's a main determinant issue also when it comes to the mobility, that can people return to those spaces that have been affected by the climate change. Then to the next issue, about the knowledge and the political collectives of the displaced. And for quite a while, the environment hasn't been focused on, or the kind of a key focus in migration theories, partly due to this kind of a technological optimism that we can sort out these climate change issues and we can adapt as a society. Partly it's related to this kind of a deterministic connotations, at least from the geography we suffer from that environmental determinism paradigm, where the environmental conditions kind of determine the outcomes of societies, which we know it's not true, and partly due to the kind of economic factors overshadowing the other issues. And of course, this is not just in the migration studies, but this is in environmental studies as well, that we studied long issues like representation and political agency and whatnot, without paying too much attention to the actual material grounds shaping the social outcomes. And what we know is that the climate change, it causes long and short-term mobilities depending on the fast and slow onset events. Mobilities can also be divided between those in close proximities and those of international distances. And just of this kind of a balance, the latter is documented more rarely, where mostly the displaced stay within the kind of near regions where the climate impacts are happening, and where you see this kind of worries or dialogues on this kind of international displacement due to the climate mobility or climate issues. I would sadly say that this political space is dominated by the right-wing populist movements and this fear-mongering about the influx of refugees. And I think this is very much true in the issues of development cooperation and humanitarian issues in general, that the most vocal who are taking the public space are these populists who are using these climate-infused migration issues as tools to demand higher borders between us and them. So it could be stated, now I'm coming to the political stuff, don't worry. In the global north, the climate mobilities, refugees or migrants, are turned more as a political vehicles, but less effort is put into allowing them to become political subjects. This is my interpretation, and correct me if I'm wrong, or we can discuss it later. But those displaced, I think, are tricky political subjects, because indeed, if we understand politics, or at least I understand that they are always drawing together some kind of a collectives of human and non-human resources for certain kind of ambitions that we seek. And in this process, it is always political as well, who shall be invited to be part of these collectives and who are those who are left out. So on this particular issue of deciding upon the issue of climate mobilities, I don't have any clear idea where the boundaries of such collectives might be. But I think one principle laid down into the Convention of the Persons with Disabilities might be useful here. Nothing about us without us. So subsequently, I do not find legitimate to making decisions and policies of those displaced by the climate change or about to be displaced without their voice, their agency. But I think immigrants and refugees in general face this exclusion from decision-making collectives quite harshly, coming always from the displaced margins without political representation of their own. So, a political strategies to allow access, capabilities and representation for those displaced by the climate change would be a paramount of importance. And of course the tricky part is that the root causes of displacements, where they would have their kind of a say on the matter, are typically quite far away then from, since they are displaced. So how we are going to kind of bridge these gaps between the policy making and the root causes, for instance, that necessitates this kind of a cooperation between different localities and even countries. And also what I would argue is kind of tricky, because when it comes to the environmental law, it stipulates quite clearly that we should abide by the polluter pays principle. But when it comes to these kind of root causes, why people actually have to become mobile, to be displaced by the climate change, having this kind of a connection between the polluters and the actual kind of victims of the polluters, it's really far away. And it's also so that it's not acknowledged in the Paris Agreement, for instance. It actually stipulates quite clearly that, for instance, when it comes to mobilizing support from the north to the south, that it's not based on any liability. Not any liability. So polluter doesn't pay. We just show solidarity or whatnot. But then we will enter to this kind of a concrete negotiation and the political forces actually of not negotiating. And what I see is that the reality is that after the signing of the Paris Agreement, it was kind of sedimented into the political domains that the atmosphere cannot handle the kind of a burden that we have put it. And according to Bruno Latour, at the same time, we have had the influential strategy of actually not giving a damn about the realities of the climate change. Because there has been long-term efforts in spreading disinformation about climate sciences, but also entering these kind of political realities where the climate change doesn't even exist. And of course, this is the kind of a message that Trumpism, for instance, in the United States exemplifies. And the message is, we take your carbon space, we take the atmosphere and treat your lives, cultures and places insignificant. And for certain, approaching this colonialization of the atmosphere and assuming that there would be this kind of a reciprocality, that we would somehow acknowledge, for instance, our responsibility of the increasing climate mobilities is not there when we approach it from this kind of approach. But this same ethos somehow reflects within the climate negotiation, because the fact is that for a long time, the initiatives crucial to the global south, they haven't not gained such a prominent position as an agenda. And I think this manifests in the question of loss and damage, for instance, that there has been this kind of a history analysis how this topic has been disregarded in the international politics. It has been, coming originally from these issues of it's not even a problem, whether it exists. Then we come to the question that, can we ever know really about this topic? We don't have the data for it. It's too difficult to attribute certain events to certain, climate change issues. Then we start blaming that, but it's not conceptually clear what we mean by this. And then finally, this question of liability, that, but it is not our problem, that it's a collective problem. And this is the kind of a reality that has been what the Global South faces in these negotiations. And issue of the mobilities, it's something that it's nowadays entering into this global negotiation, but at the very rudimentary level. That when we look at the last climate negotiation end agreement, the global stocktake, it mentions migrants and refugees, for instance, but it's part of these long chains of vulnerable peoples who to include. But that's it, no more. No specific agendas tackling these issues. And there isn't any kind of a specific agenda that we could trust that, this is where we can actually, follow up the situation. And that is, of course, the challenge that we face. But this is my suggestion, and we can continue this on the workshop, that when it comes to the agendas in the international climate negotiations, also to which Finland could have its position, is that when it comes to adaptation, just transition, loss and damage, and gender action plans, these, according to my kind of a best knowledge of the practical outcomes and where this kind of openings for in more rigorous integration of the refugee or the climate mobility issues in general could take place. And this is where we kind of need to find the cooperation and key messages also how to enter, based on the idea of returning to the earth. So this is the final slide, don't worry. So, of course, it's like when you come from the NGO sector, you always have some kind of agenda. It's never like, I'm just producing knowledge. But I'm also trying to create this kind of a sense of mobility and sense of urgency and sense of willingness to work together. But my argument is that when we enter these arenas, there are no silver bullets, because the kind of the governance of the climate agenda, it's so multifaceted, multi-level. So we need to be strategic. Where are the opportunities to actually engage? We wrote this paper, Avenues for Disability Inclusion, Climate and Biodiversity Action, for the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, and it mapped exactly this. What are the key spaces to engage? What are the key kind of a cooperation mechanisms that we can engage? Then in Finland, this political issue of the mobilities, it's part of the new reports by the government, which on the one hand sees that, it's a very tricky problem and we somehow need to work on this. And then the other paper on the development and trade says that, it's not so relevant. We just, have to push towards more commercial relationships and all things will be recovered. So in our political sphere, this might be one of the topics where to engage as well. What I hope for researchers is this kind of a support. Without evidence base, the political claims we make lack gravity. And that also creates this kind of a space of stating these kind of overarching statements that, oh, in the near future, 1 billion people will come to Finland, and these kind of political rhetorics that are not based on any realities. And we need to be able also to kind of challenge them by the scientific knowledge. Then securitization, which we see quite highly on the political agenda nowadays, it might serve as a vehicle to discuss about the climate mobilities, because this is, you understand that within this political landscape, the issues of security and securitization is a key, but of course that holds a substantial risks, that how we respect, for instance, human rights, and this kind of a portrayal of the agency of the displaced as well, even though we are talking about in the context of threats. And as boring it is, and this is always the fact, we need to have coalitions between NGOs, scientists, governmental authorities, because the fact is that among those long chains of actors, for instance, who are at risk of climate change, gender is the only one who has this kind of a very concrete action plan. And that has come there just by out of the cooperation between countries, scientists and NGOs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Niko. And I would actually right away ask the next speaker to come to the front. For all of you who are now thinking, no, but I wanted to ask a question and discuss more about this, there will be the chance to talk to Niko and other experts on this topic when we have in the afternoon the working group related to climate migration. But next, I'm really happy to introduce our next speaker. Welcome. Dr. Quivine Ndomo is a university teacher at the University of Jyväskylä and a postdoctoral researcher at Lappeenranta University of Technology. Her research interprets migrant integration in the EU through the lens of structures and institutions of host societies, such as legal status, labor market, and social and welfare regimes. Quivine uses a variety of theories in her research, including theories of citizenship rights, welfare, disaggregated human agency, social construction, and justice, among others. And today we have the pleasure to hear her keynote talk entitled Looking Back to Go Forward, Understanding the Intersection of Industrial Relations, Migration, and the Labor Market in Finland. A warm welcome.
Thank you. That's very sensitive. Right. Good afternoon, everyone. And of course, a big thank you very much. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here to have this discussion. And I also look forward very much to the discussions where we will be engaging more in the workshops that follow. I am not going to use a presentation. I'm mostly going to read out what I have prepared. But I would like to maybe put the title of my presentation in a much more simpler way. So my objective here is to make an argument for something that I call, and I think it's a general name, systems thinking. So I'm going to make an argument for systems thinking in migration research and in the kind of interventions and work that we do in the field of migration. And so I will introduce this by saying that I am sure that all of us here agree, we don't have to struggle about this, that migration is one of the most consequential issues of the current era in which we live. It has become so salient that it has been successfully leveraged to redefine established systems of democracy, social welfare, and even justice. In Finland, for example, we have several socio-political developments just in the past decade that reflect this reality. Today in the United States, migration is on the ballot, and it has been on the ballot in several countries in the Western world since, let's say, 2015 and around that time. In the EU, in the summer, in the last EU parliamentary elections, migration was also a significant or a salient definitive issue. As we redefine our democracy, as we redefine our social welfare systems and justice systems in response to migration, there is collateral damage. There are lives that are lost because of how we do those revisions, in the sense that there are people who die. And then there are also people who lose potential. There are people who lose dreams. There are people who lose the possibility to live out their full potential because of these redefinitions. And then I wonder, can migration, the simple movement of human beings across borders, really be such a potent thing to which we are reacting so strongly at institutional and national levels? And I'm then wondering that, could it be that we, all of us here, the stakeholders, we engage with migration in different ways? Could it be that we have simply just not fully comprehended the whole spectrum of what actually is the phenomenon that we call migration? Because I think that migration as simply people crossing borders cannot justify the picture that I've just painted, where actually the consequences result in lives being lost, for example. And if it was so, I think that we are a very advanced society. If migration is problematic, then I imagine that we would be able to find a way to fix it, and effectively or justly for all the people that are involved. And drawing on the theory of systems, I want to centralize the concept of system and systems thinking in this presentation to make an argument for all of us to shift, or at least to include systems thinking as much as possible in the migration research that we do and in the migration work that we do. So for the remainder of my presentation, I will attempt to map out the systemic nature of migration. I will use illustrative examples from my own research, and I will also reflect on current developments in Finnish society to drive home the point that I hope to share with you. And I hope that you will find direct implications for the work that you do. So let's start with a definition of systems. What is systems? In the simplest definition, according to a dictionary, a system is a set of things that work together as part of a mechanism or an interconnecting network. And therefore, a system is a complex whole, a whole consisting of many parts that are relating in complicated ways. And then Wikipedia defines systems thinking as a way of making sense of the complexity of the world by looking at it in terms of wholes and the relationships in it, rather than splitting it down into parts, into its parts. In other words, systems thinking is a holistic approach to analysis that focuses on the way different parts of a system interact and how they influence one another within the whole. Now, systems and systems thinking, therefore, underscore holism or synergy. But on the other hand, in our daily practice, in research, and in our migration work, we tend to do more of reductionism. Rather than holism, we tend to go on the side of feasibility, practicality, and viability. And that usually aligns more with reductionism. When you see a complex issue, it's easier to look for a small portion of it and start working on it and deal with it, rather than take on the big thing. Migration is an example of something that is complex, but it is easy to deal with one portion of it. I am sure that many of you deal with different portions of migration. I have researched labor market integration, specifically migrants and labor markets. There are people who study refugees and their integration. There are people who study migrants and welfare systems. We slice it into portions, and then we conduct whatever we do, research or policy intervention within those silos. So now, If we can keep in mind the core idea of systems and systems thinking, let us now try to define migration. But then I acknowledge that defining migration is far much harder than defining a system or defining systems thinking, as you will find in, for example, a dictionary. If you went on a dictionary and tried to find the meaning of migration, you can find anything. It could be migration of birds. It could be migration of animals. It's many things, and it's never really the thing that is so significant that our countries are changing in significant ways in response to it. So, defining migration is far much harder than defining systems because the simplest definition of migration as the movement of people across boundaries, whether internal or international, does not cover much of what the socially constructed phenomenon of migration actually is. And I bring up the idea of migration as socially constructed because it is the socially constructed version of migration that has some of the strongest consequences. The social construct of migration, or the socially constructed migration, is the form of migration to which policies respond, and it is the one that migrants actually experience in reality. Importantly, I want to point out that the socially constructed phenomenon of migration, unlike the basic version of migration, which is human beings crossing borders, is a much more complex mechanism, akin or similar to a system, and consists of complicatedly interconnected networks of institutions, of structures, that cut across multiple domains of society, from the social to the political to the economic. And then there's human beings. So you have multiple structures and institutions, and human beings coming with their agency, with their networks, which is almost a subsystem of its own. So now if we take off from this conceptualization of migration as a complex mechanism or a system consisting of interconnecting network of structures, institutions, and then people, I would like to go to the next step of clarifying or starting to clarify our perception of the phenomenon of migration in order to flesh out the factors and the actors involved in it, and then explore the complicated ways that they interact and relate with each other. And doing this is important because of the very nature of systems. The components of a system are, by structure, inherently interdependent. And as they intersect, they produce highly dynamic and therefore constantly changing circumstances, unlike what you find from stable and predictable environments that are not constantly changing. So this is an important detail for anyone working in migration, because our interventions in migration must be able to match the dynamic realities to which we are trying to respond. A nuanced understanding of migration is essential to researchers whose work inform policies, just as much as that nuanced understanding is important to the policymakers and the ones implementing the policies on the ground. So now that I have attempted to argue that migration is a complex system or a mechanism, theoretically, I am now going to try to illustrate this using empirical material or illustration. I'm going to draw on my own research and the findings of that research. And like I already mentioned earlier, I'm also going to make references to recent developments in Finnish society to show how the system of migration looks like in practice. So let's take international student migration as our example to see it as a system. So the process of international student migration in Finland cuts across multiple institutions and structures. I call these institutions and structures regimes. And the regimes that are involved in international student migration are the legal status regime, there is the migrant integration regime, there is the international degree program regimes of universities and the universities of applied sciences, there's the foreign qualification recognition regime, then there's the social welfare regime, there's migrant labor market regime, and there's the Nordic labor market regime, there's the migrant agency regime, and there's more that I have not listed. All of these regimes intersect. As they intersect at different points during the trajectory of a single migrant, they produce a very dynamic and complicated operational environment within which the migration process must be realized. Additionally, within those very many regimes that I listed, there are multiple strands of rules, conditions, and norms that further intersect and relate with each other and produce more consequences that shape the way migration happens. They do not only shape the an existing environment, but they also create very specific environments out of which we have migration taking very specific shapes and forms. So let's take one example. Let's start with, within the legal status regime, let's take the conditions of a student residence permit. To come to Finland from outside the EU as an international student, there are conditions you must meet, and there are conditions you must live within. One of the conditions is that for you to get the legal permission to come in, you have to have 6,720 euros in your bank account. And then once you're given the permit, you do not have access to any social and welfare services or privileges in Finland, such as healthcare or public healthcare or free education. It used to be until 2017, there's no longer the free education possibility. So such students usually have to show proof that they have acquired private health insurance and show proof of that for the period that they will be in Finland. The holder of the student permit is allowed, however, to work up to 30 hours a week in Finland. And this is very generous compared to other places in Europe, for example, in the US, where students are regulated much more strongly and cannot easily enter the labor market. These conditions that I've mentioned, these three, the money you have to have, lack of access to social and welfare privileges, and the right to work. These conditions intersect among themselves to create certain realities out of international student migration in Finland. So the 30-hour-a-week right combines with the demand to have the 6,720 euros for subsistence to put student migrants into the labor market as soon as they arrive in Finland. But this happens under very specific conditions. A newly arrived student in Finland does not speak Finnish. They do not have networks with Finnish people. Their friends will tend to be other students, other people from the country where they've come from. And all of this is important because it shapes what kind of job this student will be able to get. It will not matter the qualifications that student has because they will not be able to be recognized in Finland because there's a procedure for the recognition of foreign qualifications. So what happens is we have a permit system that creates a problem and a solution for the problem. The problem is the hefty economic demand in order to be given a permit makes the student socioeconomically vulnerable. But the solution is the 30-hour right to join the labor market and do whatever job you want to do. So there's a problem and there's a solution. But it creates a pattern and a system through which majority of international students who come to Finland enter the Finnish labor market. And this is only one strand. There are other systemic strands of analysis that I can make about how the conditions work together to produce certain realities. So a second relational strand develops when the conditionality of the student permit intersects with employers' cheap labor business models. Now, employers in Finland know about the rules of migration in Finland. They know the conditions of international student migrant residence permits. And indeed, an example is Posti. Posti, knowing that students would desperately need to find a job in order to be able to meet the conditions of their permit, provided jobs for students. They provided employment contracts that students could use when they're applying for a renewal of their permit. But it came with a caveat. As Posti was giving longer-term employment contracts to students, it came with lesser money than other people were getting when they signed contracts with Posti. But the students were in need, and so they accepted what Posti was offering. It's not only Posti that does this. Cleaning companies know that students need to go to school while they're also working, and they take that into consideration as they manipulate the terms and conditions of the contracts that they give to students. This is also happening in healthcare, for example. Attendo, Mehiläinen, and other private sector actors know the conditions of the permit that students have, and they exploit that to create certain conditions for the students as they want to join the labor market. Then there is the labor market that also interacts with the student legal status regime. The Finnish labor market is highly regulated. The strength of that regulation is in collective bargaining and the extension of collectively agreed conditions across sectors and industries. That depends very much on how long unions in Finland will manage to retain the leverage that allowed them to be able to participate in the tripartite consensus process. That is only possible if unions in Finland continue retaining high numbers of registrants. But look at what is happening in Finland today. There is an affront by legislative changes to the workforce. It is indirect, it is not very clear. In the spring of this year and in the autumn of last year, the unions were very active in trying to take a stance against some changes that were being proposed and were being made that threatened to weaken the union and would threaten collective agreements in Finland. When collectively agreed agreements on wages and working conditions become weak in Finland, one of the groups that will suffer the most at first will be migrant workers. Because the sectors where migrant workers are concentrated, let's take, for example, the restaurants, are the places that will be the first to be able to be relegated to local bargaining. Let's take, for example, the proposal to minimize the number of employees in a firm that would be mandated to adopt the terms of a collectively agreed terms of wages and work. If it is increased from 20 to 50, many restaurants will fall outside of the regulation of collectively agreed terms. And that is where restaurants is also where you have a lot of migrants working. Many care homes that are privately run will have less than 50 employees. Many companies that have been registered under the names of migrants who are entrepreneurs have employees that are definitely less than 50. All of these will fall outside of the collective bargaining realm. And so however much Finland will still retain strong labor market regulation, there will be loopholes. And the people who will suffer the most because of these loopholes first will be migrants. But eventually, this will spread outside of migrants and start applying to other workers. I am running out of time, so I am going to speed up my presentation. I was talking about systems, and the point of systems was how different institutions and structures intersect to produce an environment in which migration takes a very specific form. And how we as researchers, or we as policymakers and implementers of those policies, need to be aware of that system in order to be able to respond to it accordingly. So I was attempting to paint an image of migration as a complex system or mechanism within which several relational strands of structures, institutions, conditions, and norms intersect in complex relationships that define the environment in which migration is mediated. I hope that you agree with me about the fact that migration is a complex system or mechanism. But now this is the reason why I want you to accept this, or I want us to agree on this. Migration is complex, yet that complexity should be the central preoccupation of migration researchers and stakeholders like all of us here today. I did not need to tell you that migration is complex. I am sure you know that. However, my goal was to show you the importance of that complexity for our work as researchers, policymakers, and people who implement migration policies. At the beginning of the presentation, I spoke about the salience of migration in contemporary society. Now I would like to add that that salience, or the strength, or the importance that migration is taking is because of its complexity. The sheer spectrum of opportunities, whether social, economic, and political, that migration presents for varied interest groups, and how the diversity of interests and objectives of the various migration projects intersect, as I have illustrated, are the reasons why it is both complex and salient. But what does this mean for our work? I would argue that our interventions should match the case. Therefore, we should keep our focus on the complex whole of migration, and not only our niche questions and topics of interest. This is not to mean that all migration research cannot be focused. I simply mean that our research and our work should always acknowledge the complex framework that underlies the discrete issues we focus on in our work. Perhaps there can be a section of researchers who are dedicated to researching and updating the ecosystem of migration in Finland, for example, every 2 to 5 years. I have seen this being implemented in other thematic research areas, such as in worker posting. We should not compromise on the aim of a holistic understanding of the entire system of migration in Finland, so that we can be able to do justice in our analysis of various migration issues. A second point, the system of migration in Finland is a living thing, and it is productive. Here, my goal is to underscore the dynamic, indefinite, and productive nature of the migration mechanism. Migration is not passive, neither is it a concrete reality, which is definite, and which people simply engage with or do. It is far from that. In fact, migration in its living nature does some things too. Migration can happen to a migrant. It's not just migrants who do migration. Migration can do something to you if you look at it as a system, if you look at it as a system of structures and institutions. Migration is a dynamic network of rules, structures, and human life that are in constant interaction, that produce new forms and circumstances, that in turn shape migration processes and outcomes in unprecedented ways. We may not be able to predict and anticipate the form migration will take at any time, but if we have a constantly updated understanding of the migration ecosystem, we will be able to adjust our interventions without losing too much time. As a living thing, migration constantly changes as its institutions, structures, and networks keep changing, especially because of the pressures they exert on each other. Through the strategic actions of migration actors and institutions, such as the responses of employers to legal status conditions, the system of migration constructs realities of its own that would not exist outside of the migration system. Migration has always created reality, as epitomized, for example, by the parallel labor market regimes that exist in various migrant-receiving economies. However, migration policies and interventions have tended to treat migration as a concrete phenomenon that is unchanging. Migration workers should consider the productive capacity of migration as they interpret the lived experiences of migrants, as they design theories, and as they suggest policies. Lastly, the system of migration is predominantly human-made and intentional. The flip side of this is that something can be done about most of what is considered difficult or even problematic and unsatisfactory about migration. At the beginning, I wondered why the world was failing at facilitating migration in a way that would be effective and just for all. I also argued that the complexity of systems was to blame. However, if we comprehensively understand the system, the mechanism of migration, especially if we can understand the whole map of the institutions, the structures, the rules, the norms, and the circumstances that shape migration as it happens, we would be better able to target our interventions in order to achieve better results with our management of migration. And lastly, so the core issue underlying the argument I make here today about systems thinking in migration and research is the idea that you cannot really understand something that you do not fully know. And my argument is that we do not fully know migration in its entirety. We can see problems of language in the labor market. We can see problems of discrimination. We can see problems of occupational concentration. Migrants concentrate in certain jobs. If we look at those things in silos, we will not be able to. That is not migration. Those are specific things, they are specific issues, but that is not the entirety of the migration as a system. If we could make the effort to try to understand how the different things intersect, and when they intersect, the different reality that results, then I think that we will be in a better position to be migration actors. Without a comprehensive understanding of the issue in which one is intervening, the intervention will most certainly be inefficient, ineffective in one way or another. It can even be misdirected and make things worse rather than make things better. So the argument that I'm making here are equally important for you and for migrants, and then policymakers and the implementers of those policies. In the literature reviews that I have done in my research, I can say with confidence that so far, the migration research in Finland takes a reductionist approach in its perception of migration. It slices up migration into discrete silos and then deals squarely with single or a couple of silos at a time. I know that the many constraints of the work that we do make it so that we have to work that way. But I also believe that change begins somewhere. And one of the places where we could begin to make a change is how we think of migration. And today I argued that we could think of it as a system. I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Quivine. We have a small gift of appreciation for you, and Niko will also get one from Merja. And then Merja, I have the pleasure to introduce her to you in person. Anyone who hasn't met the woman behind all the emails and all the logistics, a big applause to Merja. And she will tell you now how we will continue. I can maybe just say that we will now divide into 2 work groups. She will explain that further. If you are now suddenly panicking and you're like, oh my God, I A, have signed up for a group and don't remember which one it was, or B, I have signed up for a group tomorrow, but not for today and don't know what to do, don't worry, you can still join, and Merja will let you know how and where to go.
Thank you, Saara. And thank you for both wonderful keynote speakers. So some practical things to note. Workshop Climate and Migration will be here, continue here in church. And the workshop organizers and the assistants that have this t-shirt, they will show you further. The other workshop will be downstairs in the meeting room Uno, and there as well you will be guided there with help of the workshop our organizers and assistants. Those for some reason perhaps not are attending those workshops, so we will have here in the corridor on this floor a poster exhibition. You can look and then we will also have a good thing to know, perhaps the restrooms. We have some here in connection to church room, and then downstairs at Uno and Sven as well. And on the first floor, on the opposite side of the elevators, there are plenty of the restrooms. And yes, if you want to let us or me know that you don't want to be seen in the pictures, please do so. I will be going around in the workshops and take some photos, because Ella will be busy with her own workshop. So, if any questions, yes? Coffee, of course, that is the most important. At 3 o'clock we will have coffee, both downstairs and here upstairs. Upstairs coffee will be on the corridor here next to the exhibition, and here upstairs will also be on table the special wishes for coffee. Otherwise, downstairs, dietary, exactly. And downstairs at next to Uno and Sven, you will find the coffee as well. Uno, okay, very good. So, if you have any questions, please contact me, Maria. Hotel Kakola is the Wi-Fi, and Vapaudu 2020 is the password.
I have a short, that's a good password. I have a short announcement too. We actually made the decision, because it now says in the program, Purku ja keskustelu. We have decided not to come back here to kind of hear what the workshops discussed, because there were so many of you and we had so much to discuss that the workshop organizer asked if they could maybe do the Purku, like if we could, that this time could be used still for the workshop. So actually we will not reconvene today here into this room, in this big group anymore. So I would like to take the opportunity to already here say thank you for all of you who came, and let you know that tonight, as you know, we have a reception at 6:30 organized by the city of Turku at the city hall on Aurakatu 2. So I hope we will all see each other there. But if you are now disappointed that you won't hear what the other group has discussed, tomorrow we will have at the end a small recap of all the 4 themes that we have here discussed, and you will hear about that then more. And I'm really happy that you might now think this is such a short time of keynotes and such long time for discussion, but we thought, like, after the pandemic, you can listen to lectures online, but what we can only do when we're together is actually talk and develop and think of new things. This is why this is maybe a bit different to other seminars or conferences you are used to, that the emphasis is here on actually the working group discussions, and these are like these input lectures before that, and to not just talk, but actually come up with new things to do or to develop, and I hope that works out well.
Yeah, so let's have at the workshops and enjoy the symposium. See you tonight.
Downstairs, you could follow. Sari, could you wave your hand? And Mika?